you looking for a different level of truth about your challenges and struggles? Then be a part of the Yes and podcast, hosted by empowerment strategist and trauma specialist Jennifer Whitacre. Every Wednesday, we challenge conventional thinking on topics like trauma, healing, and so much more. Learn life lessons and great nuggets of wisdom from guests who've moved through their pain and suffering to discover a new purpose in life. Now, here's your host, Jennifer Whitacre.
Hi, everyone. This is Jennifer Whitacre, and you are watching or listening to another episode of Yes and I'm your host, Jennifer Whitacre. Today's guest is Callie Wright, and Callie is a non-binary transgender person, and her pronouns are they, them. And I guess I should have said my pronouns. My pronouns are she, her, and hers.
Their pronouns are they, them.
Yeah. Callie's are they, them.
Yeah.
Yes. And mine are she, her, and hers. Callie is a super okay roller derby player, a coffee lover, and a podcast maker. Welcome to the podcast community. Well, I don't know who's been doing this longer. I've been at it for about 2 years almost. Not
I'm
quite.
coming up on 6.
So you're way ahead of me.
Yeah, I've been doing it for a while.
You can welcome me to the community. Callie's show is called Queersplaining, so please look it up. I've looked it up, and it's interesting, just the couple episodes I've had a chance to listen to. And Callie's show is a personal narrative show about the lives of queer and transgender people, which is something that's needed right now to help the rest of us understand. Because if it's not something you're around, it's a lifestyle that's hard to understand. So Callie, welcome to the show. It's an honor to have you here today, and thank you for being a guest on Yes and.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I'm stoked to have the discussion. I enjoy doing the sort of introductory conversations because my show tends to get a little 301 in terms of gender. So it's nice to be able to let's just talk about the basics. So yeah, I'm into that.
Yeah, absolutely. So could you start off by just helping the listeners of Yes and understand some of the terminology? Because I know in your bio, it says that you're non-binary transgender. So what does that mean?
Yeah, so transgender is an umbrella term that basically means that you don't identify with what you were assigned at birth in terms of sex or gender. And so if you're born and you have a penis, they assign you male, mark an M on your birth certificate, and everybody says well, you're a boy, this person's a boy, and you get he, him pronouns. And generally speaking, someone who grows up to figure out that doesn't make sense with the way they feel about themselves, the word transgender is what we use for such a person. And so there are transgender men, folks who are assigned female at birth, but feel more like they're a man. And the converse of that, folks who are assigned male at birth, but feel like they are women or are women. And then there are non-binary folks. And non-binary is sort of another umbrella term that describes kind of the spectrum of not feeling like the man or the woman label or category or box fits you entirely. And that can mean a lot of different things. There are some folks who say that they just don't feel like gender makes sense and they don't feel like they have a gender at all, or that their gender falls somewhere on the spectrum between man and woman somewhere. So non-binary is not like a third gender category. It's more of an umbrella term to describe this vast spectrum of identities that just don't really fit squarely into a man or a woman box. Does that make sense?
That makes a lot of sense to me. And I'll tell you why it makes a lot of sense to me, because I was one of those people who made my way through college by finding a major where I didn't have to take any super duper hard math classes. So I got away with statistics. And what you just described is a bimodal distribution.
Absolutely.
It's two bell curves. It's like two bell curves. You've got one bell curve for man, one bell curve for woman, has all the people that have penises, all the people that have vaginas, and then you get to the slope and the trough in between the two bell curves, and that's your binary or non-binary. Sorry, you're non-binary, correct?
Yeah. Well, okay. and gender and sex both are kind of like that. sex is definitely a bimodal distribution. It's sort of like we figured out these categories that we assign these words to, but it's far more complicated than just like one thing or another. And I'm not a biologist, so I don't feel comfortable getting more specific than that. But I've done enough reading to know that that's a thing. Gender, the way that I've always appreciated hearing gender described, I didn't come up with this, so I'm not that smart, is that gender is kind of like a color wheel. In that, like, you can kind of point to one thing and say, that's blue. You can point to one thing and say, that's green. But there's this like vast space in between that's like maybe a little bit of one, maybe a little bit of the other, maybe somewhere in between. I'm not really sure. Does it even matter? And so, a lot of people kind of talk about the gender spectrum in terms of you've got like man is all the way to the left, woman is all the way to the right, and then there's a spectrum in between those 2 points. But I think gender can be, depending on your experience of it, I think it can be a little more three-dimensional than that, if that makes sense.
It does make sense. And I think it's important too, just to take a moment and distinguish between sex and gender. Biologically speaking, sex is what parts do you have, plain and simple. It's like, do you have a penis? Your sex would be male. Do you have a vagina? Your sex would be female.
Not entirely. Because there's a category of folks called intersex who basically either their genetics don't fit with like XX or XY, or the secondary sex characteristics because of the way that their body reacts to hormones or doesn't react to hormones. There's a whole other group of folks for whom that doesn't really fit either. And so like there are folks who are born with ambiguous genitalia of one kind or another. Some folks who have both a penis and a vagina, or people who like anatomically they have penises, but their bodies don't produce testosterone or react to testosterone in the ways that like a quote unquote typical male would. And so it's even really more complicated than that. Sex is kind of a constellation of things that describes your genetics, your anatomy, the way that your body reacts to certain hormones or doesn't, and sort of all of those things kind of put together under one roof.
So is sex not biological?
It is biological, yeah.
Okay.
It's just bigger than your anatomy.
Okay, and gender, on the other hand, is so male and female and masculine and feminine. I personally see a distinction between the two, between male and female or masculine and feminine. So that's kind of my concept of sex versus gender.
Yeah,
so
yeah.
Could you talk a little bit about like sex versus gender? Because I know a lot of people, even just in regular conversations that have nothing to do with the LGBTQ community, don't get the difference between sex and gender.
Yeah, for sure. Well, because we grow up in a society where those things are conflated as being the same, even though they're not, right? And it, it just comes back to the binary thinking that we have around literally everything, not just sex and gender. But we live in a culture where like we're constructed of binaries of various kinds. So generally when you say sex, you're just referring to someone's like biological reality. So like their anatomy, their genetics, the hormones, all of that sort of thing. And then gender is more who you are socially and the norms that you subscribe to and that feel correct to you based around gender. And so it's basically like one is biological and one is social. And that's only, it's not quite that simple because I think you can make the argument that sex is also social because the concepts of sex are what we have as a society have collectively decided to refer to as sex, right? And again, like I'm not a biologist, so I don't want to dive too deep and like pretend like I know all of these things when I'm not a huge expert. But I do think it is important to call out that what we normally think of as sex as this rigid, well-defined scientific reality, like those categories were also made by people and they are not, handed down from some higher authority and rigid and immutable, things that like our definitions can't be expanded about, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that does make a lot of sense. And that was a really helpful explanation. Thank you. Because even, there were a lot of things you said in there that I wasn't aware about. I'm not a biologist either.
Right.
So,
Yes. Yeah. And
yeah,
I've had to become,
yeah,
I've had to get at least a passing familiarity with those kinds of things to just kind of be
yeah.
able to, I mean, one, like answer questions in conversations like this, where we're trying to learn, and that's great. And that's awesome. But also like from people who are actually being crappy and being jerks. I have to deal with a lot of that too, unfortunately. So like, existing publicly as a trans person is sometimes an exercise, and like you have to kind of become an expert, or at least somewhat of an expert in a lot of different things, just to sort of be able to defend the fact that you exist.
Yes. And that is so unfortunate that's what our social climate is like.
Yeah.
So are you okay talking a little bit about your experiences with just the social climate and what it's like to be a, transgendered person in
Yeah.
2020 and the world that we live in?
For sure. So
and we're both from Ohio, because my listeners know that I'm from Ohio. So or we're both in Ohio, just different parts of the state. So, the Midwest it's a tough sell on anything open-minded sometimes, it seems like.
well, and specifically where I'm at in Cincinnati is such a weird mishmash, because there's a great community of folks here, but there's also like communities of folks that are not so great. So it's like you can go like 5 miles and be in radically different places socially. It's a weird thing. But yeah, so my personal experience. So growing up, I got a lot of the same messages about gender that a lot of people do. Boys like blue, boys like action figures and toy cars and toy trucks, and boys listen to certain kinds of music and wear certain kinds of clothes and all of those sorts of things. And pretty young, I realized that a lot of those things didn't necessarily apply to me, but I didn't really know what any of that meant, right? Because I don't think I had my first sex ed class until I was 10. And even that was just like, boys have penises, girls have vaginas. Sometimes the two come together and sex happens. And it was just very, very basic, very, very binary. The fact that there was any experience or group of people outside of that was never brought up. And so I just kind of thought that I was a weird kid and that there was something wrong with me for a long time. And right around that time, puberty happens, and I just kind of had this realization, like sitting in the lunchroom at 10 years old, I think is about how old I was when I was in 5th grade. And I was by myself because my lunch friend wasn't there that day. And it was just like going through my head, and I was like, watching the way that my body was changing and watching the way that other bodies were changing, and realizing that puberty wasn't weird for me in the way that it was weird for other people. And I didn't have like words or vocabulary for that. And until I just kind of like blurted out like, oh my God, I was supposed to be a girl. And I immediately knew that there was like in the social group that I was in, that there was something seriously wrong with that it was not okay to think that, it was not okay to feel that. And so like, I never told anyone and just kind of suffered in silence about it forever. Even in terms of like, my favorite color was purple, and I wouldn't tell anybody that my favorite color was purple because purple's a girl color. Right. And then, to varying degrees, sometimes that was the front of my head and I was miserable. And sometimes I was able to kind of push it in the back burner until I was 28. And when that year, I really started to deal with depression and anxiety to the point where I was having thoughts of self-harm, and things were very, very scary in my head. And I recognized that a lot of the things that were making me feel that way were gender related. And so I just kind of, worked up the courage to put the word transgender into a search engine, because at some point in my life, I had become aware that like transgender people existed, and that was an experience that happened out in the real world. And, so I typed the word into Google and I looked, and it was just like, the more and more I read, the more and more added up. And I was like, oh my God, I think this is me. Which like, it was a relief to have a word to describe that and to understand that there was a community of folks like me. But it was terrifying because at the time I worked in a job that was very stereotypically masculine. I did high-end audio, video, home theater, home automation installations. And so we're on construction sites all the time, dealing with largely very rich, largely very conservative folks. And I mean, homophobic jokes were a daily occurrence, misogynist jokes, of course. And then, the occasional thing that would swipe at trans people in one way or another.
Yeah.
And so I
how
was
did those, and I'm curious, how did those seemingly harmless, like in conversation, people think they're harmless and, oh, just get over it. We're just joking. We're just kidding. How did that affect you?
Oh, it just made me feel entirely unsafe to be where I was, because I felt like I could never actually, obviously, like, I'm not at work with people that I want to be my best friends or, that are my family or whatever. But generally speaking, like, if I'm going to spend time around people, I like to be friendly with them. I like to know them. I like them to know me. And I like them to know about my life and the things that I do. Similarly, I like to hear about people's kids and people's spouses and like their hobbies and the things they love. Cause I'm a person who likes getting to know people. And so it just always felt like I can't bring all of myself to this. Like, when I come to this job site, there's a significant portion of myself that I have to set aside and leave behind. Like, that can't exist here. And it's, in the period of time where I was like really repressing things, it was hard, but I was able in some ways to sort of pretend like it wasn't a thing. And I think that's part of why it built up and got as bad as it did in terms of my mental health. So it got to a point where I was like, I have to talk to somebody about this. I called a friend of mine, and she was very supportive. I just kind of let it out. Like, I'm having these feelings. I think this is what this means, but I don't know. And she was very supportive. She was like, well, we gotta explore this, whatever it means, wherever it ends up. And so, long story short, she came to my house. We did a makeover. We spent a whole bunch of time talking and crying and all of that sort of stuff. But at the end of that day, I was just like, oh, okay, like, this is real. This is actually who I am, because it was the most me I had ever felt in my life up to that point. I looked in the mirror and I saw something that made sense to me, as opposed to what I had been, as opposed to what I had seen before, which was something that I was just like, physically that's me, but I don't know that that's like a representation of who I actually am. And I just, I didn't care about myself. My hygiene was terrible. I had very low self-esteem, not a ton of confidence. But once I started to embrace, who I actually was, like, all of those things started to turn around. And it was hard because I had to stay at that job for a year after I came out to all of the people in my life. And so, like, for all intents and purposes, during that year, I was two different people every day, or every work day anyways. And that was, I really think that I still feel the effects of that to this day, because before that I had some depression and some anxiety, but it was usually situational. It's like, there's this specific thing that I'm really sad about. And because of what I'm going through, I'm probably more sad about this than I otherwise would be. And I know depression is more than sadness, but that's just like words I'm using for convenience. But I never had random bouts of depression until after this. And I never had random bouts of anxiety before this. Like, before that, I could point to, like, this is a specific circumstance that's happening that's causing me to feel the way that I am. And I honestly think that baggage is from that time in my life, which is now like coming up on like 5 years ago. And it's still, and I still carry it with me.
When we are separate from our authentic selves and who we truly know ourselves to be, it creates a lot of internal suffering.
Yeah.
And oftentimes complex forms of stress, which is the day in and the day out of hiding. It's something that naturally happens in childhood. It happens in abusive homes where there's verbal abuse, neglect, emotional abuse. Doesn't have to be hitting or beatings or sexual molestation or anything like that. It can be as simple as the day in and day out verbal abuse. And having to, as a child, modify your behavior for the acceptance of your parents. And then as you get older, exactly what you're talking about, realizing that's not who I am. What you're describing sounds to me a lot like complex post-traumatic stress.
Yeah.
Which I believe depression is a form of complex post-traumatic stress.
Yeah.
I also believe that all mental illnesses are some manifestation of complex post-traumatic stress. It's just what cluster of symptoms do you have? And we pathologize it as if there's something wrong with people, instead of looking at it as, wow, you've been through this horrible situation. This is a normal coping mechanism. Let's find a way to help you through this. We pathologize it and make people feel even worse and feel ashamed that they have, something going on with their emotional health or mental health. And I would imagine that coming out was a challenge for you. Are you okay talking for a few minutes about what that was like to come out?
Definitely. Yeah. So like I said, I called that one friend who was someone that I was very close to at the time. And she was great. And that was, I think, what gave me like the strength to start coming out to other people. Cause I had at least like, this could have gone disastrously, and it did not. And so like, maybe I can do this again and it won't be bad either. And so I sort of started to just identify like, who are the people that I am absolutely the closest to that I can talk to about, to sort of like build that base of support for like when maybe it all comes crashing down and someone very important to me isn't on board. And so I went, I met with another one of my best friends who happened to live behind me at the time. And so I sent him one of those texts that I feel bad about the way that I did this because I'm sure it stressed him out a little bit. I was at work and I was just like, hey, like, you got a minute this afternoon? I need to come to your house and talk to you about something. And he was like, yeah, sure. Is everything okay? And I was like, I think so, but I'm not sure. And like, I'm sure that was really stressful for him. And I have apologized profusely for him. But I came out to him and it went very well. He was just like, well, this is, it's really surprising. I'm not entirely sure that I know what it means. But like, I love you. And so I want you to be happy. And so like, whatever that means you need to do, I want you to do. And like, whatever like hangups I have about it, like I'll work through. And like, as long as we can talk openly with each other about stuff, then like, we'll do the thing. And that was kind of the repeat of the conversation that I had sort of over and over again, was like, it's really surprising. I don't really know what it means, but like, I love you and I want you to be happy. And so I was super, super fortunate in that way. I did lose 2 important family relationships. My aunt just straight up refused to even entertain the idea of respecting who I was. And my grandma, very conservative, Pentecostal, was basically like, well, I'll always love you, but you know what the Bible has to say about that sort of thing. And then she tried to convince me that I was like possessed by a demon that was making me feel this way. And it was really gross, and tried to make it work for some time. And I actually made the decision to cut off contact with her, not entirely because of trans reasons. There were other things too, but that was sort of the impetus for it. And I lost some friends along the way, no important friendships. But I got really lucky. I did the job that I was at. I lost that job over being trans in a sort of indirect way, because it wasn't like my boss was like, I don't like that you're trans, you're fired. It was just like, our clients are super rich and super conservative, and they're not going to want you in their houses. And I'm like, yeah, like you're right about that. And that sucks, because it was a small business. We were a company made up of literally 4 people. And this guy is like living in his, I think it was living in his sister's basement with his 2 kids at the time, trying to save money to buy a house. Like, he's trying to feed his family, and I'm not trying to get in the way of that. If this was a big $1 billion corporation, I'd be ready to tell HR, like, you got to burn the place down for this, but like, this is just like a guy trying to feed his family, and I'm not trying to get in the way of that. And so eventually it just kind of became clear that it wasn't going to work, and I quit. But yeah, I mean, I lost that job because I was trans, somewhat indirectly, but I mean, that's what it was.
I am eagerly awaiting the day when that becomes illegal to fire somebody because of things like this.
Yeah. And I mean, in some states,
not okay.
It is, thankfully, but definitely not federally. And it sucks too, because like, I mean, people can be sneaky about it and do it for that reason without saying it's that reason and get away with it. And so it's like, there's definitely laws that need to be fixed, but there's culture that needs to be fixed too. Yes,
absolutely. There's definitely culture that needs to be fixed. And yeah, how do we go about that is the question. Like it's easy to point out the problems. To come up with solutions can be a little bit more challenging, because the solution requires other people to change, and I don't have control over that.
Right. Yeah. And I should say, that's the first of two comings out, because at the time I didn't understand that non-binary was a thing. Like as far as I knew, there were two boxes, one didn't fit, so I had to pick the other.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of the trappings of that felt very correct to me at the time. Like, long hair, makeup, dresses, painted nails, stereotypically feminine everything. That's kind of what made sense to me at the time. And so at the time it was, trans woman, she, her pronouns. And it wasn't really until, probably 4 or 5 months ago, that I really had the sort of like, I guess, come to Jesus moment is the best way that I can think to describe it now, that non-binary is actually what made the most sense to me. And it would take me a really long time to talk about like everything that brought me to that point. But a lot of stereotypically gendered things just stopped making sense to me. And even thinking in terms of the gender binary, I don't really fit neatly into one category or another. Thinking about the binary and the requisite stereotypes, I don't really fit into those things. But also, like, I'm just kind of like trying to opt out of thinking that way at all. Thinking in terms of like, okay, well, I have this category and I have this category, and I tick these boxes in this category and these boxes in this category, and like whichever category has the most check marks is the one that I have to pick. Because I think trans people feel a very strong pressure to do that. To be seen as respectable, to be seen as like worthy of being taken seriously and respected. There's even among some trans people, there's sort of an attitude that people who are non-binary are confused, and that like eventually you'll settle down and pick one, or that like it's not serious, you're doing it for attention because you want to be special, and all of that sort of stuff. And it's all crap. Like all of that is crap. Mm-hmm. So, I just had a couple of really strong experiences around clothing, around gendered language, and those sorts of things that were just like, none of this really fits to me. Like the man box doesn't fit, the woman box doesn't fit. And then it was just sort of about figuring out what language felt correct. Like I would literally say out loud, like, my name is Callie and I'm a man. Oh my God, that feels terrible. Like I want to like wash my mouth out when I say that. That's terrible. And when I say like, my name is Callie and I'm a woman, and I'm like, okay, like that maybe feels like a t-shirt that doesn't fit right. Like, it's not the worst thing in the world, but it certainly doesn't seem like it fits. And then, my name is Callie. I'm a non-binary person and my pronouns are they, them. Like that all just started to feel the thing that was the most correct to me. And then, so I kind of did the same thing. I had some really close friends, my wife, my roller derby teammates. And I was just like, hey, this is a thing I'm thinking about. Can I just try this for a couple of days? Like, have you use they, them pronouns when talking about me, around me? And like, cause I just want to see how it feels. And immediately it felt correct to me. Like it felt right. And just being referred to in generally gender neutral ways is what feels correct to me. And so I'm finally comfortable claiming that language to refer to myself. And I think it was a little bit easier because it's far less of a big coming out, because everybody already knows that I'm trans, and I'm just like, well, I'm just a different kind of trans than I maybe thought I was before. And so that's been less of a big deal. That was more like personally for me, feeling like I finally figured out like what makes sense to me and what fits in a way that feels like it fits more than the other thing did.
Yeah. Well, thank you. That's a wonderful explanation. And that's helpful. And that's interesting, because that's what you described. I've heard so many people say is like, oh yeah, they'll figure it out. They'll eventually settle down and pick one. And it sounds like it took you a really long time to unpick one.
Yeah.
So fascinating. Absolutely fascinating. And, one thing I talk about a lot, because I specialize in intergenerational and developmental traumas, and it's a lifelong journey to connect with ourselves authentically and really learn who we are and all the bits and pieces. It's this big exploration of the subconscious.
Yeah. Cause I mean, we're handed so much and told like, this is what you have to be, and this is who you have to be.
Yeah.
And I was fortunate because like all of the crappy stuff about gender came from places outside my own home. Like my mom was fantastic. I love my mom to death. And we have a great relationship still to this day. She's one of my best friends and I love her dearly. And coming out was a big deal to her, but it wasn't a problem. And we're all settled in and that's all fine. But I feel really fortunate that, my mom definitely did set the, like, I want you to grow up to be a happy and healthy adult. And I don't really have any other wants or expectations for you aside from that. And she would do the mom thing where she would like, I'd be like, well, I'm going to be in a band and a famous musician and tour the world. And my mom is like, well, if you love music, maybe be a music teacher because that's something you can actually pay your bills with and something you might, so like, she definitely was doing the mom thing, but that was all of the right stuff to do. She never discouraged me from like following my self-expression, all of the like weird haircuts that I had when I was a kid and all of the clothes that I had. Like I never got more than an eye roll from that. And I think my mom was entitled to that and that's totally fine. But I think I had a lot of baggage to wade through. I would just thankfully I didn't have quite as much as some people do because I didn't have those super rigid standards when I, growing up at home at least.
Yeah. Yeah. So could you help us understand a little bit more about the pronouns? Because I get the, he, him, and she, her, hers, and, they, them. I get that. It's a little harder to understand, and I'm not even sure how to pronounce them. I've seen pronouns with the letter Z in them and also with the letter X in them. So where do those come from? And so can you just help us understand the pronouns and does that kind of fall into the bimodal distribution also?
I don't know. I would say generally speaking, yes, but not always. Like, I don't find it useful to think of pronouns as inherently gendered because there are non-binary people who are comfortable with she, her, or he, him pronouns. And that's kind of why I asked my friends if they would just kind of test they, them out on me for a couple of days. Because I was like, I don't know, like she, her, like it, I don't know, So obviously, he, him is the stereotypical masculine pronoun. She, her is the stereotypical feminine pronoun. They, them is generally speaking, the gender neutral pronoun you will find most non-binary folks use if they want a gender neutral pronoun. But like Z-zim, Z-zir, those sorts of, we call those neopronouns. And my understanding is the origins of some of them are in just like languages other than English that have a commonly used gender neutral pronoun. And some of them are just like pronouns that folks have just said like, well, what we have in English doesn't make sense to me. So this is what does make sense to me. And they just kind of put it out there as why, and it makes sense to some other folks and they decide to use that as well. And so, yeah, it's really kind of as simple as that. I love the idea of normalizing just like asking and giving pronouns as a matter of course, socially. I've really worked on, as soon as I learned like way back when I first came out and I learned that non-binary people existed, I definitely kind of started an effort to sort of degender my language as much as possible. Cause I think that's an important thing to do. Cause there's so much like crappy misogynist baggage wrapped up in some of the language that we don't even think is wrapped up that way. But yeah, it really can be just as simple as like, hi, my name's Callie. My pronouns are they, them. I'm a big fan of introducing yourself with your pronouns as a matter of course, instead of necessarily asking people for their pronouns. Because if I say, hi, my name's Callie, my pronouns are they, them, that's an implicit invitation for the other person to do the same if they're comfortable doing that. But the thing is, like, we all always have to realize that we might be in an environment where it's not safe to do that. So for me, I play roller derby. I'm physically strong. Generally speaking, I can handle my own. If people want to get physical with me, that's probably not going to go super well for them. Generally, I feel safe wherever I'm at. And so I don't mind I don't lead like, hi, my name's Callie. I'm your local trans, I don't lead with that. But I don't, in most situations, I don't feel uncomfortable or unsafe outing myself as trans, which if I say my pronouns are they, them, obviously that's what everyone's going to think. Or they'll just be confused because obviously not everyone even knows that non-binary trans people are a thing. But some people aren't comfortable that way. If someone on the outside appears to be a very stereotypically feminine person, but turns out they're a trans guy that uses he, him pronouns, that from an onlooker who would be interested in hurting a trans person, that perceived mismatch between their appearance and the way they're asking people to refer to them can out them as trans. And that can create an unsafe situation. And so I don't like to, unless I'm in a space where I know that's an okay thing to do. I don't like when I meet strangers, I just say, hi, my name's Callie. My pronouns are they, them. And I just leave it to the other person to handle however they want. And I will just use someone's name in place of pronouns, or I'll use positive identifiers. Like when I give talks at conferences and I call them, say like, oh, my friend there with the blue hat, or, my friend there with the Ohio State shirt on, like something along those lines.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. And all of this makes sense to me, because if we really take a deep dive and start to look inside of ourselves, I think every one of us are going to have some sort of question of, okay, where do I fall? I consider myself I guess I would be cis white, female. And at the same time, when it comes to the femininity, I don't see myself as super feminine. Like when it comes to the stuff that we normally associate with women. I hate to shop. I don't really care too much about makeup. I, put a little bit of eye makeup on, but that's about it. So the stuff that makes girly girls, there's a little bit more toward the masculine spectrum. I'm happier in a pair of sweatpants than I am a skirt.
Yeah. Well, and for me, that just sort of comes down to just figuring out what language feels the best to you.
Yeah.
What feels right is right, because you're not hurting anybody. You know what
exactly.
I mean?
Well, and it's an interesting self-exploration. It really is. Like if everybody just got honest with themselves and really looked inside, I think they would see that they don't fit neatly into any of these, male, female boxes or masculine, feminine boxes that you're talking about.
Oh, absolutely. I actually had a friend, I was out of town for a storytelling event, and I was staying with a friend, and this was just like right around the time where I had come out as non-binary, and they had asked me like, is it cool if we ask where that come from? And I spent probably an hour and a half just like running down like all of the experiences that I'd had that led me to think of myself this way. And my friend's just sitting on the couch and her mind is just like blown. And she's like, I don't have a different experience than anything you just said. So like, did I just figure out I was non-binary? And I was like, I don't know. Did you cause ultimately, people can have similar experiences, but have different levels of comfort around the language that they use to describe them. And that's okay. I think so much of the difficulty that people have is, as a species, human beings generally, we're uncomfortable with ambiguity. Generally speaking, we like neat answers. We like solid answers. It is either this thing or the other thing, or one of these three things, or something along those lines. And we get very uncomfortable when it's like, well, I don't know what the answer is. It doesn't, it's different for everyone, and that's okay. And I think honestly, that's where so much of the discomfort around trans people comes from, because as a trans person, I have been forced into doing a lot of self-exploration that a lot of people never have to do. And in some ways that's a gift, right? I know myself very well. And I've been able to sort of identify the things about myself that I don't like and try to change them. But also being forced to do that self-exploration and living in a society where what I figured out about myself is not generally considered an okay thing. That's really tough. And I think part of the reason is that people are threatened by that.
Yeah. And one thing that, and I'm going to overgeneralize here because I know there are exceptions, and I'm definitely overgeneralizing. And it is a lot of the people that I work with, again, working with trauma and childhood trauma, people who are okay with not knowing are people who have come through their traumas, they've healed from them, and they've made it to the other side, and they're not still struggling with that internal mindset that, it's just like this negative feedback loop of internal self-talk that really holds us down. That type of traumatized internal self-talk is what needs to know. It's that super ego, that mindset. I call it the narrator because it's it's always telling, it's always creating stories based on your perceptions and your experiences in life. And so your experiences in life have been vastly different than mine. So if you get caught up in your story as if it's the only truth, and I get caught up in mine, then of course we're going to butt heads and we're going to clash, because it takes curiosity and understanding out of the equation. And what I've seen, it's been my experience that people who have healed from those traumas and they've found a way inside their own mind to get that voice under control and have some sort of control over that voice, where that voice becomes the servant, not the master. And they're the ones who are okay with not knowing. They're okay with the curiosity. They're okay with, okay, let's try this out and see what happens. Just like what you explained with, do you mind calling me they, them for a few days and just see how it goes for me? Could you help me out here? It's almost like a little experiment. So I do believe there's an element of trauma on both sides of it, and it sounds like you've come through a lot of your trauma, because I can't imagine anybody being, in the LGBTQ community in America who doesn't have some sort of trauma just from the social climate and just from, walking outside. I don't know the experience of walking out my door into public as, a trans person, as a queer person, as a lesbian. I don't know what that experience is like. So for me to sit here and somehow judge somebody else and say that their experience is invalid because I haven't had it is ridiculous.
Yeah, I agree. For me, figuring all of that out has been such a gift, not just in learning about myself, but in the connections that I've been able to make with other people and learning about where people are coming from. Because, the great joy of making my podcast for me is just meeting all of the rad people with this wide variety of experiences, and learning that, like the trans experience does not have to be inherently tragic, right? Like, it often is, but that's not because of our transness. It's because of how other people react to our transness. And, doing that, I think has one, it's been a lot of great self-exploration for me, like learning from other people, but also just like the learning for their own sake that other people have gotten to a place in their life where they're able to do amazing things and they've overcome all of these obstacles. It's been great for me in, reminding me that, that this is okay. Like, this is an okay thing to be. Like, the problems that I face around my transness are, they're societal problems. They're not problems that I have brought on myself because of the kind of person I happen to be.
Yeah. So what is the social climate like? Like, what are some of your experiences with, just like being out in society, and, what is that like? Do you mind talking about the social climate a bit?
No, not at all. So a couple of important things to point out. One is that I am white, and that greatly reduces the stress that I feel in every day for being trans. Trans people of color really get the worst of it in terms of everything, honestly. The other is that I am a middle-class person. I'm not poor. And that greatly changes the experience that I have relative to other people. That being said, for me, the stress is more systemic and societal. Thankfully, on a day-to-day, the worst that I get is like people whispering about me under their breath at the store, the rude comment here or there, somebody saying a really crappy thing. a really like crappy comment on a YouTube video that comes from my podcast, crappy email, crappy DM, that kind of stuff. There has been one time where I legitimately thought that I was in danger of violence. And it was just my wife and I, girlfriend at the time, wife now. We were at the store. I think we had just signed the lease for our first apartment, and so we were at the store like getting cleaning supplies or something mundane like that. And there was a guy that like just kept looking at us and then looking back at his wife. And I try really hard not to attribute stereotypes to people's emotions, but like he read as being very angry while looking back and forth between me and his wife. And as they were leaving the store, he turned and he was walking directly towards my wife and I. And I mean, just hate in his eyes. Like I had seen that like in like the protesters at Pride festivals that are like screaming slurs at you. And you can tell that these people are just absolutely hate filled. Like it was that look that he had in his eyes looking straight at me. And at the time my wife had no idea this was happening. She was like looking towards me. And we were talking and I was just kind of glancing over I didn't want to freak her out. But like he was walking towards us and like at a quickened pace with just hate in his eyes. And at the last minute, he just like turned to walk the other way. And so like, thankfully nothing actually happened. But that was absolutely terrifying. I will say like personally where it's the grossest for me and where it hurts the most for me. And again, this is a marker of privilege, but I get to travel rather often, to do interviews, to do conferences, all of that sort of stuff. And being trans at the airport is not fun. So I have had bottom surgery. I had vaginoplasty 2 years ago. And ever since then, in, I don't know, probably 24 trips through the airport, there have been maybe 2 or 3 times where I didn't have to endure a crotch pat down from the TSA, because body scanners are not, do you know how the body scanners at airports work?
I really don't. I mean,
Yeah.
they can kind of see your naked body through your clothes, right?
Absolutely they can.
Okay, that's what I thought. Yeah.
Well, and what they say is that unless someone has authorization, they don't actually see the pictures the machine takes. But what happens is you walk up, there's a pink button and a blue button, and the agent picks one based on the way that you look. And the machine then scans for the stereotypically appropriate anatomy for that button that you have pressed. And if there's a quote unquote anomaly, that part of your body gets flagged for pat down. And so there have been times where my crotch has flagged and I asked, like, are you screening me as female? And they would say yes. And I'm like, that doesn't make any sense to me because like at this point in my life, the machine is looking for the anatomy that I have. So like, I still don't know. And even the TSA agents don't know. That's why this is all security theater. I was flying home from New York last night and the TSA agent told me that she thought the lettering on my shirt might've triggered the scanner. Like it's all crap and none of it makes any sense or does any good for anyone. But yeah, I had a TSA agent ask if my breasts were prosthetics once. Because my chest flagged the machine and they have to kind of like feel up around your bra. And that was really humiliating. And then when I was in Seattle on the flight back, as I approached the machine, the guy was like, raise your hands like you do. Like you put your hands above while the machine scans you. And as I raised my hands, he goes, oh, hang on. Sorry, I hit the wrong button. And then the other TSA agent walks up behind him and she goes, oh yeah, from a distance, it looked like the other thing. And I guess they're just depending on the fact that most people don't understand how those machines work. But like I had to do the research because I'm like flying as a trans person. I need to know what I'm getting myself into. And so I knew exactly what they were saying. And like from a distance, it looked like the other thing, like being talked about like that, like I'm not there, knowing what, like that was so dehumanizing and so humiliating. So that was really gross. And there have been times in those crotch pat downs where legitimately the agent's hand has touched my vagina. It feels really gross and I hate it. And I don't even I've heard stories far worse than my own about that too. And so that's kind of the kind of the luxury that a lot of people have that they probably don't even think about. I mean, obviously nobody likes the TSA, but that's probably the most visceral thing for me that I experience on a regular basis, is just kind of like being humiliated by having a stranger touch the sensitive areas of my body regularly, because they don't, in one way or another, because they don't fit with what is expected.
Yeah. And I didn't even know the TSA thing was, I didn't even know that was a thing that you had to go through. I thought, here I am thinking that, okay, there's a person of color in front of me. They're more likely to get the random search than I am, because, the random searches are not random. I'm sorry. They're just not random.
Yep. That is also true.
Yeah. And customs, oh my God, customs, like coming back into this country.
Oh yeah. I have not flown internationally, and I am not looking forward to my first time.
It's not random. Have flown to Canada several times. So when I go through customs in Toronto, I don't have to do anything when I get back to Columbus. Just get off the plane and go home. So they are not, unbiased in the customs department at the Toronto airport. I've witnessed it several times. It's like I can almost stand in line and pick out the people in front of me that are going to be pulled off to the side or taken to the room in the back.
Mm-hmm.
And
yeah. And this is, to open a whole other can of worms. I know we're short on time, but I will say, in terms of like things that make me really remember that I'm not welcome in a lot of areas of society, is the current discourse about trans people participating in sports. Because I play roller derby, so I play a very physical, violent contact sport. And there's lots of people that don't feel like I should belong there, and people that think that literally that my presence is dangerous there.
And I don't understand. I cannot get my head around that line of thinking. What are the types of things that they say to you, and what are the reasons for saying you shouldn't participate?
Well, generally the idea is that, as a person whose puberty was fueled by testosterone, that just it gives irreversible advantages that people whose puberties are fueled by estrogen do not have. Which is just, it's inaccurate. Like, it's just scientifically inaccurate. Like, that's not actually how it works. Because we were talking about, sex being a bimodal distribution, right? It's a bell curve, and so like, even if we accept a binary on that case, like it's objectively true that there's wild variation in terms of that. For example, like Michael Phelps, right? And they found out that his muscles naturally produce like 1/3 the lactic acid of a real person's. It was like, oh my God, what a genetic marvel. Or like if a 7-foot tall woman joins the WNBA, nobody's going to say like, well, she has an unfair advantage, so we have to stop her from participating. So, the argument generally is that we have an unfair advantage, which of course the conversation, they never talk about trans men having an inherent disadvantage. Because the joke that I always have is that cis men shouldn't be able to participate in men's sports because they have an inherent advantage over trans men, which is not true, but that's the facetious thing to say in response.
Right.
But what it comes down to is like, there are lots of places where trans people are allowed to compete in sports, and we don't dominate. Like, we don't regularly dominate everyone in a way that makes it obvious that we have an inherent advantage. And that even feels like a gross argument to make, because then I'm arguing my own mediocrity as evidence for why I belong. And that sucks. I don't like that at all. But and then I just think about playing roller derby and how often I get my ass kicked. Like, in theory, I should have an advantage over all of these cis women. And I clearly do not. Because there are some that kick my ass regularly and very, very hard. And then there are some that I kick their asses. Like, I'm kind of in the middle of the pack on that. But also, like, it's been such an amazingly positive thing in my life, like legitimately life-changing. Like, if I never played roller derby again, my life would forever be better for it. And the idea that trans folks shouldn't have access to something like that, it breaks my heart. And it breaks my heart to know that there are people who have been pushed out of sports of one kind or another for those reasons, because it's been such a positive thing in my life.
Right. And I understand that you won't ever tell anybody what you refer to as your dead name.
Yes, that is.
So and I'm assuming your dead name is the name you were given at birth.
Right.
So can you talk about why? Because again, that's something I didn't know was a thing. And so I'm just curious as to, what that's about. If you're
So obviously, obviously names are very important, right? It's the word that you, generally speaking, it's the word that you hear most often in reference to yourself. And so there's a lot of self-identity that's wrapped up in your name. And so not every trans person feels the way that I do. That's important to point out.
For sure.
But for me, my dead name is a representation of a person that I am not anymore, largely. And at a time in my life where I was not living authentically and I was not presenting my true self to the world. And so, I have those feelings with that name. Again, important to point out, trans people are not a monolith. Not everyone feels that way. There are some people who will literally say well, when I was Jim, that doesn't resonate with me. Like that doesn't feel good to me at all. And so, that's like the one thing, I've done probably 6 or 7 episodes of my podcast about my vagina. I don't really have any shyness about that, but yeah, my dead name is something that I will never tell anyone because of those feelings about it. I'd rather talk about Calliope and how she's the Greek muse of epic poetry and has a really neat story that I feel resonates with my own life a lot. And that's why I picked that name. I feel confident saying that most trans people feel somewhat similarly to me about their dead names, and that most of us would prefer to leave those in our past, even if their feelings aren't quite as strong as mine are on the subject. And so it's very important to not always err on the side of forgetting your trans friends' dead names and never use them again, even in reference to the past. Not a thing, like I said, not a universally held opinion, but I feel confident saying that's the majority opinion.
Yeah. Okay. Well, that's really helpful. And so this has been eye-opening and enlightening for sure. Because again, it's a topic, this is the first time I've had this topic on my show.
Yeah.
And it's such an important topic because, there are a significant number of people in the population who fall into the LGBTQIA community. And it's my humble opinion is that it's important for all of us to coexist and to get along peacefully. There are a lot of people in the world that I would rather keep at arm's length, and that's okay. I can keep them at arm's length and still coexist peacefully. There doesn't have to be anger and vitriol. And so I hope some of this discussion cleared up any questions that people might have, maybe raise some questions. And it sounds like your podcast could help answer any more questions that people have, which is Queersplaining.
Yeah.
Could you just tell our listeners where to find your show?
Yeah, for sure. Queersplaining.com is the website. The show should be on all of the podcast platforms. Anywhere you get podcasts, you should be able to get my show. And if that's not true, let me know because I would be bummed to find that out. But yeah, you should be able to find it anywhere you find podcasts.
Okay, wonderful. Well, thank you so much, Callie. This has been really helpful.
Yeah, I'm so glad. Thanks for having me. It's been a great talk.
Yeah, it has. It's been it really has. It's been a good conversation. And before we finally sign off, do you have any final tips or bits of wisdom to leave with our listeners today?
I would just say be proactive. Learning about these kinds of things and learning how to be respectful of queer folks, but trans folks especially, is allyship is a verb. It's not just a thing that you are, it's a thing that you do. And so it's very important. I am one member of the trans community. I'm not, we're not a monolith. I can't speak for everyone in the community. And so I think it's really important to do your best to seek out the voices of folks, other folks in the trans community, especially folks who have different experiences than mine, trans people of color, poor people, disabled people, folks who have those sorts of intersecting identities that I don't necessarily have. Like all of those voices are very important. And I think it's important to make an effort to seek those voices out as well.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much, Callie. It's been an honor to have you here today.
Thank you so much for having me.
And for all of our listeners, again, this is Jennifer Whitacre. You are listening to another episode of Yes And. If you want more information about my show, You can find me at jenniferwhitacre.com, and you can find more information about my podcast at jenniferwhitacre.com/podcast, or you can look me up on Facebook. Just look for Jennifer Whitacre, and that's where you'll find me, and you'll find this episode on Facebook and on my website in a few weeks. I think this will come out. I have it straight in my head. I think it's February 12th. If that's a Wednesday. If I got the date right, somewhere in there. So this is Jennifer Whitacre signing off, and I will see all of you next week.
We have just concluded another episode of the Yes and podcast with Jennifer Whitacre. For additional resources, please visit our website, jenniferwhitacre.com. Leave a review if you enjoyed the show and find it useful. Until next time, continue challenging conventional thinking and keep moving forward.